June 3, 1962. 1:14 p.m. The sun was high over 125th Street, bouncing off car hoods and shop windows, turning Harlem into a mirror of heat and noise. Street vendors shouted, kids chased each other between parked cars, women in pressed dresses carried brown paper bags home from the market. It was just another Sunday afternoon, until a single gunshot cut straight through the noise. People would later say it didn't sound real at first. It sounded too sharp, too clean, like something from a movie. But when they saw the man fall, when they saw the blood spreading across the white of his summer suit, the screaming started. The man's name, in the underworld, was known only to a few as Carlo "Red Shoes" Mancini, an Italian enforcer who collected debts for one of the 5 families. To most of Harlem, he was just another well-dressed stranger who never smiled, who stared too long at the wrong people. But to the woman now standing over him, a small revolver still trembling in her hand, he was something else entirely. He was a problem that had come too close to her front door. The woman's hat was tilted low, her gloves spotless, her dress the kind you wear to church or to lunch, not to a shooting. She did not look like a gangster. She did not look like someone who knew the feel of a trigger. She was Mamie Johnson, Bumpy Johnson's wife. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Red Shoes lay on the sidewalk, eyes open but seeing nothing. The crowd parted in a jagged circle around him. Some people ran. Some ducked into doorways. Others just stared, unable to process what they'd just seen, a respectable Harlem woman putting a bullet into an Italian mobster in broad daylight. Across the street, a fruit stand owner dropped the apple in his hand. A bus driver hit the brakes so hard that passengers lurched forward, smacking into the seats ahead of them. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to wail. Mamie didn't move. The gun was down at her side now, but her face was calm in a way that made the few who could see it step even further back. There was no wildness, no panic. Just a cold, steady resolve. 2 men pushed through the crowd, moving fast but trying not to look like they were in a hurry. Harlem men. One of them whispered, "Miss Johnson, come with us." Now. Mamie looked down at Red Shoes one last time, as if memorizing the scene. Then she nodded, slipped the revolver into her handbag as naturally as if she were putting away a lipstick, and walked between them toward a waiting car. By the time the police arrived, Carlo Mancini was dead. The woman who had killed him was gone. And the story had already started to spread. Bumpy's wife just shot an Italian on 125th. White boy from downtown, made man they say. In broad daylight. Didn't even run. By sunset, the rumor had reached downtown social clubs and uptown backrooms. By nightfall, it had traveled across the river, into the dark paneled rooms where the 5 families met to discuss business, territory, and problems. Bumpy Johnson was already a problem. Now, they were hearing his wife had pulled the trigger on one of theirs in the middle of Harlem, with witnesses everywhere. Every man at that table knew what had to happen when someone touched one of their own. There were rules. There was pride. There was the face you had to show the world. But the more they heard about how it happened, who did it, where it was done, who watched, the more something unexpected crept in around the anger. It wasn't just insult. It was fear. Because if you understood how the Harlem underworld really worked in the early 60s, you understood one thing. Bumpy Johnson didn't leave anything to chance. And if his wife had pulled that trigger, there was almost no way it had been an accident. To understand why that one gunshot shook the Mafia from Harlem to Little Italy, you have to understand 2 people, the man who ruled Harlem and the woman who refused to let anyone rule her family. Section 2. The woman behind the King of Harlem. By 1962, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson was more than a name whispered in pool halls and backrooms. He was a force. To the Italian mob, he was an obstacle. To politicians, he was a phone call that could make problems disappear. To Harlem, he was something else entirely. He was the line. On one side of that line were the outsiders. Italian mobsters who wanted the numbers racket, crooked cops who wanted easy money, slumlords who wanted rent even when there was no food in the icebox. On the other side were the people of Harlem, shopkeepers, barbers, church ladies, kids in worn shoes. Bumpy stood on that line. And more often than not, he stood in front of his people. The Italians had tried muscle. Men sent up to shake down bankers and numbers runners came back with broken noses, wired jaws, or not at all. They had tried money, quiet envelopes slid across tables in dim bars, offers to partner up. Bumpy listened, smiled, and then turned them down, telling anyone who would hear it that Harlem was not for sale. But if you watched Bumpy only in smoky back rooms and street-side arguments, you missed half the story. The other half lived on 120th Street, in a well-kept apartment where the curtains were always pressed and the silver always shined. That was Mamie's domain. She had been raised to believe in dignity, in clean floors and straight backs, in the idea that even if the world refused to respect you, you could still respect yourself. When she met Bumpy, she didn't know everything he did, but she saw two things clearly. He protected people nobody else protected. And he needed someone who would protect him from himself. Mamie was not a gangster. She did not run rackets. She did not stand on corners. But Harlem is a small place when it wants to be, and the city has a way of pressing into your living room whether you invite it or not. She saw the envelopes that came in. She saw the bruises Bumpy tried to hide. She heard the whispers, names like Costello, Genovese, Gambino. She also saw the men and women who knocked on their door late at night with problems nobody else could solve. A landlord trying to throw a family out. A kid taken off the street by cops who lost his paperwork. An Italian collector who decided interest meant fear. "Are you going to handle it?" she would ask. "I am," Bumpy would say. "Good," she'd answer. "Because if you don't, I will." For years, that was a joke between them. A line he'd smile at while loosening his tie. But the world the two of them lived in didn't stay in one place. The pressure grew. The money got bigger. The violence got closer. When the five families couldn't break Bumpy with business, they started looking for something else. A weak point. Someone he loved. That's where men like Carlo, Red Shoes, Mancini came in. Red Shoes was not a boss. He wasn't important enough to sit at the long tables downtown where deals were made. He was useful. A collector, a watcher, a man sent to test the edges of a boundary. 6 weeks before the shot on 125th, people started noticing a new face standing just outside of Harlem's comfort zone. At the corner by the fish market. Near the record store. Across from a certain brownstone on 120th where a particular woman came and went with grocery bags. He never came too close. He never said a word. He just watched. Always the same red leather shoes, polished so bright they almost hurt to look at. Mamie noticed. Of course she did. One afternoon, she set a bag of produce on the kitchen counter and said, "There's a man with ridiculous shoes who doesn't know how to be subtle." Bumpy didn't smile. Italian. What? Suit better than his posture. Doesn't belong on that corner and knows it. "You been feeling followed?" "I've been feeling disrespected," she said. "There's a difference." Bumpy knew what it meant when the Italians started sending men to stare at doorways instead of counting receipts. It meant they'd given up on negotiations and started thinking about leverage. "Stay off that side of the block for a while," he told her. "Let me handle it." But Harlem life doesn't pause because trouble shows up. Groceries have to be bought. Kids have to be walked to school. Church hats have to be picked up from the milliner. The world doesn't stop moving just because men with guns decide it should. The first time Red Shoes spoke, it was almost polite. "Mrs. Johnson," he called out as she stepped off the bus, his accent flatting her name, turning Harlem into a word that didn't fit in his mouth. "Can I have a word?" She didn't stop walking. "My husband handles words." "That's why I'm here," he said, falling into step beside her. "Your husband has been difficult. The men I work for, they prefer things to go smooth. You understand smooth, right?" "I understand that you're walking on the wrong street," she said without looking at him. "I'm just saying," his voice dropped. "Sometimes wives can talk sense into their men. Some husbands listen to wives more than they listen to business." There was the line being tested. The edge of a threat, soft at first, wrapped in charm. "They sent you all the way from Little Italy to give marriage advice?" Mamie asked. "You should tell them to ask for their money back." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell your husband to meet. He gives up a piece of Harlem, the numbers, maybe a corner here or there, And everybody stays happy. Everybody stays safe. He let the last word hang in the air between them. Everybody. Mamie stopped then. Turned to look at him. She took in the suit, the tie, the slicked hair. The red shoes gleaming. The confidence of a man who thought fear worked the same way in every neighborhood. You tell your bosses, she said evenly, that if they have something to say to my husband, they can say it to his face. They don't send dogs to bark at doors. She stepped closer, so close that anyone watching from a window would have thought they were sharing a secret. And if you ever mention my family's safety again, you're going to find out that Harlem wives don't bark. We bite. He smiled in that way some men do when they think a woman is performing for them. You're brave, he said. I hope you stay that way. He tipped an imaginary hat and walked off, whistling something off-key. Mamie went home. She put groceries away. She set the table. And when Bumpy came in that night, she told him everything, every word, every look, every pause. He listened quietly, his jaw working, his fingers tapping once against the table. I'll handle it, he said. You better, she answered. Because the next time he comes near me, I'm not going to waste time with words. The thing about promises in a world like theirs is simple. Sometimes, to keep them, you have to be willing to cross a line yourself. Word traveled fast through Harlem's quieter channels. The man with the red shoes wasn't just any collector. He was connected to a crew that answered to one of the 5 families, men who believed that pressure applied to the right place always got results. There was an unspoken rule in the underworld. Families were off limits. Wives, children, mothers, they were supposed to be invisible in the calculations. That was the rule, at least when men said it out loud. But rules have a way of changing when money is on the table and pride is at stake. For 2 weeks after that conversation on the sidewalk, Red Shoes kept his distance. He watched from farther away. He didn't speak. Bumpy had his people following him, noting who he talked to, where he ate, where he laid his head at night. A few times, Bumpy could have had him taken. A van, a dark street, a body found hours later in the East River. That was how most of these stories ended. Quite forgettable. But Bumpy knew something the Italians never quite understood about Harlem. Power wasn't just about what you did. It was about what people saw you do. If he snatched Red Shoes off a dark corner, it would send a message to a handful of men in suits. If something happened in broad daylight, on Harlem's main artery, in front of shopkeepers and grandmothers and kids buying candy, that message would echo in every barbershop and back room from 110th Street to the Bronx. So he waited. He didn't tell Mamie everything he was thinking. He never did when the plan involved risk. He told her to be careful, to avoid certain corners, to keep an eye out. He had a man on every block she walked. He set up quiet signals with shop owners and bus drivers. Harlem was a net, and he was tightening it around one man. Red Shoes took the bait without knowing there was bait. That's the thing about arrogance. It makes you think you're hunting when you're really being led. One Wednesday, he stepped a little closer than usual. Stood across from the Johnsons' building, smoking, the heel of one red shoe pressed against the brick like he already owned the block. On Friday, he walked behind Mamie at a distance as she headed to the market, stopping when she stopped, crossing when she crossed. Not touching. Not speaking. Just letting her feel his eyes. By Sunday, he felt brave enough to speak again. The street was busy that afternoon. Church had just let out, and the sidewalks were full of people in their best clothes, talking about sermons and Sunday dinners. Mamie stepped off a bus on 125th, hat angled just so, handbag tucked under her arm. Red Shoes fell into pace beside her. You didn't pass the message, he said quietly. I passed it, she replied. My husband doesn't take well to threats. This isn't a threat, he said, reaching out a hand just close enough to brush her sleeve. This is an opportunity. For him. And if he doesn't want it, maybe we talk about what you want. You don't seem like a woman who enjoys living with this much danger. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. The way his eyes ran over her, not like a man talking business, but like a man deciding where a bruise would show the least. Across the street, a pair of teenagers playing stickball slowed, watching. At the corner, the fruit stand owner pretended to rearrange oranges, eyes locked on the two of them. One of Bumpy's men, leaning against a parked car a half-block down, shifted his weight and felt for the gun at his back, waiting for a sign. The sign didn't come from him. It came from Mamie. She stopped walking, turned to face Red Shoes fully. People brushed past them, annoyed, then curious as voices dropped and a strange stillness bloomed right there in the middle of the sidewalk. "You think I don't know what you're trying to do?" she said, voice low but clear. "You think threatening me is going to make my husband weaker?" He smirked. "I think everybody breaks when you push the right way." She looked at his hand on her sleeve, then at his face, then, deliberately, over his shoulder at the shop windows reflecting the two of them. She could see them clearly there, a tall white man leaning in, a smaller black woman standing firm. The picture of exactly what Harlem was tired of seeing. In that split second, something clicked into place. Maybe it was every story she'd ever heard of women who disappeared because men like him decided to send a message. Maybe it was the faces of the girls in her building who walked past that corner every day. Maybe it was simply the promise she'd made in her own kitchen. "The next time he comes near me, I'm not going to waste time with words." Her hand slipped into her handbag. In most stories like this, someone has to give her the gun. A husband, a cousin, a friend from the block. But the truth in neighborhoods like Harlem is simpler and sharper. Women learn quickly that relying on someone else's protection is a luxury they can't always afford. The steel felt colder than she expected against her fingers. Red Shoes saw the movement too late. By the time his brain registered that her shoulder had squared differently, that her elbow had locked, the revolver was already out, its barrel rising in a clean, practiced line. There were no warning shots. No shouted threats. Just one crisp sound that sliced the afternoon in half. The bullet hit him square in the chest, just above his tie knot. He staggered backward, shock more than pain on his face, as if the idea that a woman like her, a wife, a lady, could actually pull the trigger didn't fit in his world. He dropped to the sidewalk, Red Shoes flashing once in the glare before they stilled. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The teenager's game stopped mid-swing. The fruit vendor's hand hovered over a crate. Somewhere, a preacher's voice drifted from a radio, talking about judgment, about lines you do not cross. And in that heartbeat, Harlem learned something new about the woman whose name most of them only knew from whispers. She was not just the king's wife. She was part of the line. Bumpy's man down the block didn't move at first. He didn't have to. Mamie lowered the gun slowly, breathing steady, as if she'd simply put down a heavy bag. People stared at her not like they were looking at a criminal, but like they were seeing something they hadn't known they needed. Then the spell broke. Screams started. Someone shouted for an ambulance. The man by the car approached her quickly, respectfully. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "we have to go." She looked at Red Shoes, at the blood, at what she had just done, and then she nodded. "Take me to my husband," she said. The 5 families would hear that a wife had shot one of their men. They would talk about disrespect, about retaliation, about blood. What they didn't know yet was that Bumpy had already been preparing for this moment. Because in his world, you didn't just plan for the moves you made. You planned for the ones you knew your enemies would force you to make. Section 4. The message behind the bullet. When the car door closed behind Mamie outside Small's Paradise, the usually easy laughter leaking from the club seemed too loud, too ordinary. Inside, where the music hadn't started yet, Bumpy stood with 3 of his most trusted men, a map of Harlem spread on the table in front of them. He looked up when she walked in. For a second, husband and wife just stared at each other. Not as king and queen of Harlem, not as symbols, but as 2 people who had just crossed a line they could never uncross. "Ellsworth," she said quietly. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice even. "Not a scratch." He moved closer, eyes scanning her, hands hovering just short of her shoulders as if afraid that touching her would make everything too real too fast. "You did it in the open?" he asked. "In front of everyone," she said. He put his hand on me. He talked about safety. "I remembered what you always said." "What's that?" She held his gaze. "Harlem is watching." For a long moment, Bumpy didn't say anything. Then, slowly he nodded. "You did what you had to do." One of his men cleared his throat. Boss, words already moving. Italians are going to lose their minds over this. They should, Bumpy replied. They sent one of theirs to put hands on my wife in my neighborhood. They thought there'd be no cost. Now they know different. He turned back to Mamie. They'll say you broke the rules, he said. She almost smiled. Their rules never protected us. It didn't take long for the call to come. By early evening, a message was delivered through a mutual businessman, a man who sold nothing but information and introductions. The 5 families wanted to sit down. Tonight, they could have declared war. They could have sent cars rolling through Harlem with men hanging out the windows, guns in hand. They could have quietly put a price on Mamie's head and waited. But that would have meant stepping fully into the light, admitting that one of their own had been careless enough to get himself killed in public. And that he had been careless with a woman, in a neighborhood where those watching would pick a side. So instead, they did what powerful men do when they are angry but unsure. They asked for a meeting. Midnight found Bumpy in a back room above an Italian restaurant on the edge of Little Italy. The table was long, the air thick with cigar smoke and the smell of garlic. 4 bosses sat at the far end. A 5th chair, empty, marked the space where Carlo Mancini should have been if he'd lived long enough to be important enough to sit there. You brought your wife's temper into our business, one of them said as Bumpy took a seat. You know what happens when somebody touches one of ours. Bumpy placed his hands flat on the table. Your man didn't just touch one of yours. He came after one of mine. She is not in this life, another boss said. She is a civilian. She is supposed to be out of reach. Then why was your dog on her street? Bumpy asked. Why was he putting his hands on a woman coming home from church? You want to talk rules? Let's start there. They argued. They threatened. They talked about balance, respect, the need to show strength. Bumpy listened. Then he did something the Italians didn't expect. He didn't apologize. He didn't flinch. He turned their anger back on them. You send a man into Harlem to lean on my wife? You think I'm going to hide her? He said. You think I'm going to tell her to be quiet, to look at the ground, to pray some man in a suit downtown fixes it? He leaned forward, voice low but caring. You're angry because you lost a soldier. I'm angry because you sent him to my home. The difference between us is simple. You can find another soldier. I can't find another wife. Silence settled over the table for a moment. Behind the bosses, their lieutenants shifted, exchanging quick glances. The math was changing. You want this to be a war? One of the bosses said finally. We can make it that. If you could win that war in Harlem, Bumpy said calmly, you wouldn't be sitting here talking. You'd be sending flowers. He let that sink in before he continued. What happened today wasn't just a woman pulling a trigger. Harlem saw what you sent to our streets. They saw what she did about it. Every man, every kid, every mother who heard that shot knows now that if you come for us, we won't just call the police. We won't just call me. We'll handle it ourselves. You think that scares us? A boss snapped. I think it scares your money, Bumpy replied. Because men who aren't afraid don't pay as easily. Neighborhoods that believe they can defend themselves don't roll over for collectors in red shoes. He sat back. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to call your man what he was, careless. You're going to admit he broke the code first when he brought his hands and his threats onto my block. And then you're going to make sure no one like him ever walks up to my family again. You're not in a position to make demands, one of them said, but there was less bite in his voice now. I'm not making demands, Bumpy said. I'm telling you the price. Because if you decide this is blood for blood, you won't just be fighting me. You'll be fighting a neighborhood that just watched a woman stand her ground against one of yours in the middle of the day. You want that story spreading? You want that legend growing? The room was quiet. Legends were dangerous things. They inspired people to do unpredictable things. Finally, the oldest man at the table spoke, his voice softer, more calculating. Families are off limits, he said. We all agreed. Maybe our associate forgot that. Maybe he thought Harlem didn't count. Maybe he paid for that mistake. He looked at Bumpy. We don't touch your wife. Or your daughter. Or your home. You keep your people from making a spectacle out of killing ours. We let this lie here. It wasn't the apology Bumpy might have wanted. But it was something more practical, a public line drawn and acknowledged. "Fine," Bumpy said. "But understand something." He stood, smoothing his jacket. "You men sit in rooms like this and talk about respect like it's a word on a ledger. Up in Harlem, we don't have the luxury of talking it to death. We either live it, or we get stepped on. Today, my wife showed you something you weren't expecting." "And what's that?" one of them asked. He looked down the length of the table, past cigars and empty glasses, past men who had ordered beatings and murders with a nod. "She showed you that in Harlem, even the women are done being afraid of you." When he walked out, some of them were angry. Some were insulted. But all of them were thinking the same thing. If the wives were willing to pull triggers now, what else was Harlem willing to do? Back uptown, the story of the day grew the way all great stories do. With each retelling, a new detail, a new layer. Some said Mamie never blinked when she fired. Some said she recited a Bible verse over Red Shoe's body before walking away. Some swore Bumpy had placed the gun in her purse himself that morning, knowing what might come. The truth was simpler and sharper. A man crossed a line. A woman refused to step back. In the weeks that followed, no more Italian collectors came strolling down 120th alone. No more strangers in red shoes lingered by the building. Shopkeepers slept a little easier. Girls walking home from school looked at Mamie with a new kind of respect. She still set tables. She still pressed curtains. She still ran a home that felt like a sanctuary in a city that sometimes forgot black families were even there. But now, she carried something else with her wherever she went. A quiet legend. Years later, kids who had been on that street that Sunday would tell the story like a fable. The day Bumpy's wife shot a mobster and didn't run. They'd say it with pride, with a spark in their eyes, because in a world where power usually came from men with money and guns and foreign last names, it meant something to know that sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room was the one nobody had bothered to fear. The 5 families never officially admitted they changed their calculations because of a single woman's bullet. Men like that rarely give that kind of credit. But they stopped sending loan collectors into Harlem. They stopped testing that particular line. Because power isn't just how many soldiers you have or how much territory your map covers. Real power is what people believe about you when you're not in the room. On June 3, 1962, in the blinding light of a Harlem afternoon, Bumpy Johnson's wife rewrote that belief for an entire neighborhood. If this story of a woman who refused to be leveraged, a husband who understood what real protection means, and a neighborhood that watched it all unfold gave you something to think about, you know what to do. Hit that like button so more people hear it. Subscribe if you want more of these hidden Harlem legends, the ones you won't find in most history books. And tell me in the comments, if someone like Red Shoes showed up on your block, watching your family, how far would you go to draw your line?